Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world where the air smells like warm bread crust and faint incense, where the stone halls echo softly with slippered feet and humming psalms, and where, just beneath those chapel walls, something is bubbling, literally. Because tonight, we're not visiting knights, kings, or grand battles. No, we're heading straight into a quiet little convent tucked away behind ivy-covered walls, where the real action is happening in the brew house. That's right, you, humble traveler, are about to become an apprentice brewer to a nun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing who's falling asleep across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the stony path at dawn. The mist still clings to the grass in little curls, and your breath fogs in the cold morning air. Beyond the wooden gate, the convent's walls rise in a soft arc, not exactly threatening, but solid like they're used to keeping secrets inside. A bell rings somewhere overhead. The sound vibrates through your chest. Someone opens the side door. It's not a priest or a stern abbess with furrowed brow. It's Sister Hilda, a stout, practical-looking woman with flour on her sleeve and a smudge of ash across her cheek. She eyes you once, nods curtly, and beckons you in without a word. You're not here to pray. Not exactly. You're here to brew. Inside, it smells like yeast and honey, sweet, earthy, and oddly homey. Sister Hilda leads you through the cloister courtyard, past neatly raked gravel and rows of cabbages. As you walk, she explains the basics. Every convent brews. Not every nun, of course, but many convents in medieval Europe, particularly from the 9th to the 14th centuries, operated full brewing setups. Beer wasn't a hobby. It was sustenance. And these weren't dainty batches either. This was full-scale production for dozens of sisters, plus guests, laborers, pilgrims, and the occasional local. You're guided to the brew house, a low building with soot-darkened beams and wide copper kettles. Sister Hilda points to a giant wooden spoon leaning against the wall, taller than you. You can guess what your job is. The brewing process has already started. Grain is soaking in a vat of hot water. This is the mash, where the magic begins. It smells nutty, like oatmeal and roasted hay. You stir slowly, feeling the resistance of the thick mixture. It's oddly meditative. Sister Hilda's voice hums behind you, half explaining, half praying. Malt must rest long enough to release its sugars, she says, but not so long it turns to porridge. She chuckles, then hands you a small cup of pale, cloudy liquid. Try. It's not bad. Warm, tangy, a little flat. You expected worse. She watches you closely. First runnings. Sweetest. We save that for the abbess. You'll get the third. Historically speaking, medieval beer came in tiers. The first run, the strongest, was for honored guests or clergy. The second might be for the sisters. The third, the weakest, often went to children or the poor. And yes, you're at the bottom of that ladder, dear apprentice. Still, it beats the alternative. Because water, nope, you don't drink water. Not in medieval Europe, not unless you want a charming collection of stomach bugs and one-way trips to the infirmary. Brewing beer, boiling it, fermenting it, flavoring it with herbs was the best way to make liquids safe. Even infants were given small beer. Which makes this convent a fortress of hygiene, in a weirdly tipsy sort of way. As you scrape the bottom of the vat, you start to notice how smoothly everything runs. Sister Hilda times her steps by instinct. Another nun, quiet and quick, swings a pail of water just as the next stage begins. No one barks orders, yet everything hums in harmony. Brewing, here, is almost holy. Not in the singing angels way, but in the sense that it's part of the rhythm of devotion. Every act scrubbing barrels, measuring grain, monitoring bubbles can be a kind of prayer. Ora et labora. As the Benedictines said, pray and work and pray. Still, don't get the wrong idea. This isn't some magical nun utopia. Brewing was hard, gritty, and sometimes dangerous labor. You're dealing with boiling liquid, open fires, and splinters the size of sewing needles. Your arms ache after just an hour of stirring. But you keep going, because whether or not Sister Hilda says it aloud, this brew is important. Historians still argue whether convent beer was really better than secular brews. Some say yes, nuns had access to rare herbs and careful methods. Others claim monk brewers, with their famous abbey ales, outshone the sisters. The truth probably depends on the region, the season, and whether the abbess allowed anyone to experiment with the recipe. One quirky detail: in some convents, ale was flavored with herbs like bog myrtle, rosemary, or even lavender long before hops were widespread. These weren't just for taste, they were thought to have healing properties. That headache you've had since dawn. Sister Hilda hands you a cup with a wink. Drink this. You'll feel like yourself again in an hour. Or someone else entirely. You sip. It's bitter, herbal, and slightly effervescent. You're not sure if it works, but you don't care. The stone walls glow golden in the morning light. The steam rising from the mash dances like incense. And for a moment, you forget you're centuries away from your own bed. You're just a sleepy apprentice in a quiet convent, helping brew the only thing keeping this little world safe, clean, and slightly more cheerful. You don't wake up to the sound of birds. You wake up to the sound of clanking. Somewhere in the convent, someone is already rolling barrels, opening hatches, stoking fires. It's not even dawn yet, but brewing waits for no one, least of all you, curled up under a scratchy wool blanket in the guest dormitory, hoping this is all a strange, yeasty dream. But no Sister Hilda is banging on the wooden door with a spoon. Time to tend the barley, apprentice. You groan, loudly. It does nothing. You roll out of bed and into your boots, still faintly smelling like malted grain from yesterday's shift. By the time you reach the brew house, the fire's already hot under the kettle. The mash tun, yesterday's bubbling cauldron of soaked barley, has been drained and rinsed. Today's task: boil the wort. You're not entirely sure what that is yet, but Sister Hilda hands you a wooden paddle and gestures like you should know. And you stir, again. Beer in medieval convents wasn't a once-a-month project. It was part of the daily rhythm, especially in larger convents, some of which housed up to 100 nuns. Beer was brewed several times a week, and not just for the sisters. Convents were responsible for feeding and caring for a variety of guests, pilgrims, local peasants in need, visiting clergy, the occasional weeping widow looking for sanctuary. They all needed nourishment, and, naturally, something to wash it down. Which is how you end up sipping beer before breakfast. Don't get too excited. It's barely alcoholic, maybe 1 or 2%, cloudy, and warm. Think liquid bread more than cheerful buzz, but it's better than the other options. And, somehow, the nuns have managed to normalize it. One sister blesses the beer at the table. Another passes it around like it's soup. No one jokes about getting tipsy. No one drinks too much. They all drink just enough. Historians believe that for many medieval religious women, beer was part of the balanced diet alongside porridge, beans, root vegetables, and the occasional fish on feast days. Some documents even suggest beer was recommended for digestion. And since nuns often lived strict, ascetic lives, fasting, kneeling, praying, teaching beer offered a surprisingly vital source of calories. There's even an old rule from the Benedictine order that limits monks and nuns to a single pint of wine a day, but says nothing about ale. Sneaky. You take another sip of the breakfast beer. It's faintly sweet, a little sour, and thick enough to chew if you tried. One sister drizzles hers over her porridge. You make a mental note to never copy that. You finish eating just as the sun peeks over the garden wall. The convent shifts into its next rhythm. Some nuns file into the chapel for morning prayers. Others head to the kitchen, the laundry, or the tiny infirmary. You and Sister Hilda back to the fire. As the wort boils, the scent changes, less grassy now, more roasted, nutty, almost caramelized. You don't know this yet, but that smell is the Maillard reaction, the magical browning that gives beer its depth and flavor. Of course, no one in the 13th century knows this either. They just call it the syrup stage. You ask Sister Hilda what happens if the beer boils too long. She squints at the kettle. Then it tastes like the abbess's sermons, flat and overdone. That earns her a laugh from a passing nun, who coughs pointedly before disappearing toward the chapel. You've noticed this already. Humor in convents is quiet, dry, and deadly accurate. You get the sense that years of obedience turn sarcasm into a spiritual art. The beer boils down for hours. You help with the next step, transferring the hot liquid into wooden cooling trays set near the open windows. It has to cool before yeast is added, or the brew won't ferment, it'll just cook. Yeast, by the way, isn't even a concept yet. Medieval brewers didn't know what it was. They just knew that if they let the liquid sit in the right place, something mysterious would bubble up and turn it into beer. They called it God is good. God is good. Modern science calls it Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But here, now, it's just a blessing. Sister Hilda doesn't question it. She leans over the steaming tray, inhales deeply, and crosses herself. You copy her, awkwardly. Give it one night, she says, and we'll have something worth pouring. Not all convents were this organized. Of course, some barely scraped together enough grain to brew monthly. Others, like this one, had purpose-built brewhouses and dedicated teams. Archaeological digs in places like Germany and northern France have uncovered remnants of mash tuns, brewing kettles, and even long, narrow fermentation troughs behind nunneries. Concrete proof that these women weren't dabbling. They were professionals. Historians still argue whether brewing was a skill every nun learned, or whether it was assigned to a few trained sisters. Some records suggest that nuns rotated duties, spending a season in the brewhouse before returning to scribing, nursing, or teaching. Others describe long-serving brew nuns who stayed at the job for decades, trusted for their nose, their memory, and their ability to tell when a brew had gone bad from just a whiff. One delightful bit of trivia. In some convents, a nun's brewing tools, her spoon, paddle, and mash rake, were passed down ceremonially to her apprentice, like sacred relics. Imagine inheriting your predecessor's favorite ladle, lovingly worn at the edges, and knowing it stirred hundreds of gallons of salvation. You stir absently, watching the steam curl like incense again. The late morning sun filters through the open shutters. It smells like barley and warm wood. And, strangely, you're not tired anymore. There's something hypnotic about the process. The rhythms, the warmth, the trust that everything will bubble in its own time. Maybe for these sisters, beer isn't just food. It's a kind of faith. You prepare the grain, you stir the pot, you wait, and you believe something good will rise. The third day in the convent begins as most days do, abruptly, with the clanging of a metal ladle against the inside of a bucket. Sister Hilda's preferred method of waking you up has not evolved, and neither has her fondness for sarcasm before dawn. Up, apprentice! The barley won't roast itself, and the last batch is starting to smell like Brother Ulrich's socks. You're not sure who Brother Ulrich is or what his feet smell like, but the threat is enough to get you moving. Today, you're learning how to malt. That means preparing the barley, soaking it, letting it sprout just enough to awaken the sugars inside, and then drying it before it can turn into a full-blown plant. The process takes days and requires constant attention. Too damp, and the grain molds. Too dry, and it dies before it does its job. You find yourself crouched on the cool stone floor of the malting room. The barley has already been soaked, and now it's spread out in thick golden layers across wide mats of woven straw. Your job is to rake it gently, turning it so it doesn't overheat or clump. It's repetitive, sure, but weirdly satisfying. The scent is earthy and raw, like walking through a field right after rain. And of course, Sister Hilda is watching you with the intensity of a hawk who's seen one too many apprentices leave clumps in the corner. "Turn it like it's your confession," she mutters. "Every piece counts." You don't argue, you just rake. As the hours pass, you notice that brewing isn't just one job. It's dozens of tiny, interconnected tasks. And in many convents, brewing was woven into the structure of the whole community. While you tend the barley, other sisters are chopping wood, fetching water, grinding herbs, or scrubbing casks. It's like a quiet, beer-themed ballet, choreographed over centuries. One sister passes by humming, carrying a bundle of dried yarrow. Another nods to you while stirring a pot of honey and rosemary over the outdoor hearth. Here, every action matters. Every hand has its place. Historians still argue whether these brewing duties elevated nuns' social standing within the convent. In some orders, the brew nuns were seen as skilled artisans, respected, even powerful. In others, the work may have been considered menial, something handed off to novices or servants. But in this convent, at least, Sister Hilda runs the brewhouse like a general, and you, poor apprentice, are her mildly confused foot soldier. By midday, the barley is dry enough to move. You help carry the trays outside, where the wind can finish what the fire started. Sister Hilda squints up at the sky. "Should be ready to mill by morning," she says, then wipes her hands on her apron and adds, "Unless God decides we need rain." Again. You've seen the grain mills at the edge of the convent, tall, creaky wooden structures powered by a slowly turning water wheel. "You'll be there tomorrow," she says. "Learning to grind malt is a rite of passage." But before that, there's cleaning, always cleaning. You help scrub the inside of a barrel that smells faintly of elderflower. Sister Hilda explains that certain batches of ale are flavored, not just for taste, but for medicine. Convent brewing wasn't just about hydration or calories. These women were amateur pharmacists. They added herbs for digestion, for energy, for fertility, ironically, or to balance the humors. That's right. These were beers that cured your black bile or soothed your hot spleen, at least in theory. One old recipe lists mugwort, chamomile, nettles, wormwood, and a generous handful of blessed thistle. You don't know what that last one is, but it doesn't sound friendly. There's even a tale possibly exaggerated of a nun in 11th century Saxony who brewed an ale so infused with medicinal herbs that local knights used it to clean their wounds. One of them reportedly drank a full jug, passed out, and woke up with his infected arm mysteriously healed, or possibly just numb. You don't ask Sister Hilda to recreate that one. Still, you begin to realize that the line between kitchen, infirmary, and brewhouse is blurrier than it seems. Brewing wasn't separate from healing, it was healing. And in an age with no antibiotics, no pasteurization, and no modern plumbing, ale was one of the safest things you could put in your body. Even children drank it. Not the strong stuff, of course, but small beer, a low-alcohol version that was thinner, lighter, and brewed from the third or even fourth run of the grain. You watch as one of the younger novices, barely 12, sips from a chipped wooden cup between chores. No one blinks. It's just part of the rhythm. Still, don't romanticize it too much. Brewing was exhausting. By evening, your hands are raw from hauling buckets. Your back aches from crouching over the malt trays. Your knees crack when you stand. And Sister Hilda, somehow, still looks fresher than a morning roll. You slump beside the hearth where a few sisters are finishing their evening cups. They smile kindly and offer you a piece of crusty bread. And you think, just for a moment, that this life, hard as it is, isn't so bad. There's comfort in the ritual, safety in the routine. But just as you start to doze, Sister Hilda nudges your foot with the toe of her boot. Rest if you must, she says, but tomorrow we test your nose. If you can't tell stale hops from a sweet ferment, I'll send you to clean the privy barrels. You open one eye? There are privy barrels. She grins. You'll find out. You close your eyes again. You're not sure if it's the beer or the fatigue, but the fire seems to crackle softer now, like it's laughing with you. And somewhere in the dark, the last of the malt finishes drying beneath the stars. The next morning, it's not the clang of Sister Hilda's ladle that wakes you. It's the scent. Toasted grain, a little sweet, a little smoky. It drifts through the hallway like some sort of holy incense, summoning you from your blanket like a spell. You don't even grumble. You just follow it. Outside, the sun is rising over the cloister garden, casting golden light across the dewy cabbages and the tops of the cooling trays. Sister Hilda is already there, of course, squatting next to a shallow pan of roasted barley and lifting it by the handful to her nose. "Smell this," she says, without turning. You do. It's deeper than yesterday's malt, richer, with a hint of bitter chocolate and something warm, like bread crust. She nods at your reaction. That's what we want for winter brew. Apparently, different seasons call for different roasts. Summer ales are lighter, with pale malt and floral herbs. But for winter, you want body, strength, and flavor that can stand up to the cold. As she talks, she pours a scoop of roasted grain into your hands. Color tells you one thing, but smell tells you the truth. Then she points to a second tray, same barley, but scorched. That one's ruined, too close to the fire. Burnt malt makes bitter beer, and bitter beer makes cranky nuns. You nod sagely, trying to memorize the difference. And then, as promised, she tests your nose. Over the next hour, you sniff everything from lavender to licorice root, bog myrtle to juniper berries, all stored in a row of little ceramic jars. Sister Hilda calls it the flavor cupboard. It smells like a witch's pantry, and you're not entirely sure some of the herbs aren't magic. One curious item, sweet gale, a plant used in early brewing long before hops took over. It has a peppery scent and was believed to stir the passions, which led to at least one bishop banning it from monastic beer altogether. Not this convent. Though, Sister Hilda just laughs and says, "What passion, we haven't had a scandal since the bread oven exploded in 1237. You're starting to realize that beer, in this place, is more than just nourishment. It's culture, tradition, identity. But let's pause for a moment to talk about why beer became so essential in medieval Europe, especially in religious communities. We've already covered the basics: unsafe water, calories, and the comforting glow of mild intoxication, but there's more. For one, beer had staying power. Unlike milk or fresh juice, ale could last for days, even weeks, if properly stored. It could be made with local grains, and it could be produced year-round with a little planning. That made it a reliable staple in a time when plagues, famines, and bad harvests were disturbingly common. Also, monks and nuns were expected to live simply. Beer, especially homemade beer, fit that lifestyle. It was humble, unfancy, but if you knew what you were doing, still delicious. And many of them did. Historians still argue whether convents or monasteries produced more beer overall. The records are patchy. Some claim the monks had more land and resources, giving them the edge. Others argue that nuns had more flexibility in their routines, which gave them time to perfect the process. What's clear is that both took the craft seriously and that the nuns' contributions have often been overlooked. One little-known fact, some convents recorded detailed brewing logs. A surviving example from a 12th century German abbey includes notes like, "This batch tastes sharp, possibly the water," or "Increased honey for St. Gertrude's feast, well received." You can almost picture the scribes, heads bowed over parchment, carefully tracking foam levels and fermentation times with the same care they gave to copying psalms. You finish your smell test and are rewarded with a small sip of something called feast ale. It's darker, sweeter, and gently spiced, brewed only for holidays. Sister Hilda calls it their liquid vespers. And this brings us to another delightful tradition, the feast day beer. See, while convents lived under strict religious calendars with fasts, silence, and penitence, there were also feast days, days when joy was not only allowed, but encouraged. Saints' birthdays, founding anniversaries, important liturgical celebrations. On those days, the rules loosened a little and the ale flowed a lot. Some convents brewed special batches just for these occasions, often with extra herbs, spices, or a bit more alcohol, clove, cinnamon, honey, even dried fruits, all made an appearance. In one German nunnery, feast day beer was so beloved that the abbess had to lock the cellar door the night before, lest the novices get into it early. The key, it was said, hung on a chain around her neck like the keys to heaven. You and Sister Hilda sit near the cooling trays and drink slowly. The sun is high now, and the garden buzzes with bees and sleepy flies. It's peaceful in that specific, golden way that only early afternoons can be. She tells you about her first brew, a disaster that overflowed and nearly flooded the storeroom, about a runaway barrel that rolled into the garden and flattened a cabbage patch, about the time a visiting bishop mistook a bottle of extra fermented barley wine for vinegar and tried to bless it. You laugh more than you should, but then again, this isn't just history, it's story, memory, legacy. And somewhere between the raked malt, the stirred wort, and the sweet gale, you begin to feel like you're part of it. You help gather the herbs for tomorrow's brew. You clean out the old fermenting troughs with vinegar and brush. You eat bread dipped in broth and drink small beer with dinner. And when the sky turns pink, you find yourself lingering a little longer in the courtyard, where the barrels are stacked like sentinels, watching over the convent. You think, I could get used to this. You think, maybe I was a nun in a past life. You think, or maybe I just like the beer? Either way, you sleep well. You wake to rain, tapping gently on the leaded glass window, the kind of slow, rhythmic drizzle that makes everything smell like stone and soil. Even the convent seems to be moving a little more slowly today, less bustle, more quiet, shuffling in slippers. You stretch, wince at the soreness in your shoulders from yesterday's grain hauling, and drag yourself into your boots. When you step into the courtyard, it smells like wet earth and barley mash, comforting in a way that doesn't make sense until you realize you're getting used to it. Sister Hilda greets you with a smirk and a linen cloth thrown over her shoulder. "Today," she says, "you're going to learn why we don't drink the water." You raise an eyebrow. You'd assumed you already knew. It's gross. Everyone says so. But no, she means really learn. And she means it with a bucket in hand. You're headed to the well. The convent has two. One for brewing, one for everything else. Guess which one is deeper, colder, and locked with a rusted iron hook. Sister Hilda removes the latch, lowers the bucket, and pulls up a pail of water so clear it sparkles like a blessing. "This," she says, "is our lifeline." In medieval Europe, most towns had to make do with contaminated streams, shallow wells, or rainwater caught in mossy barrels. Pathogens, parasites, tannins from decaying leaves. If it sounds awful, it probably lived in the water, which is why beer, boiled and fermented, was so essential. What you don't expect is how deliberate the nuns are about every step. The water isn't just boiled in a general way, It's added at specific temperatures, for specific durations. They test it with fingers, with bits of straw, with tiny brass spoons worn smooth from generations of tasting. You start to notice how scientific it all is without the science. Historians still argue whether brewing in nunneries was truly innovative or just inherited from older folk traditions. After all, women had been brewing at home for centuries before convents took it up as a professional duty. But here, within these walls, that folk wisdom has calcified into something precise, something almost sacred. Sister Hilda adds a pinch of ground mustard seed to a sample of brewing water and watches how it disperses. It tells her something about the mineral content. She doesn't say what exactly, just nods as if the water whispered back. She hands you a second bucket and sends you back to the brew house. Now we steep. Today's brew is something special, a charity ale, brewed not for the sisters, but for distribution to local poor families, especially widows, beggars, and pilgrims who knock on the convent gate with sore feet and hopeful eyes. The recipe is slightly thinner, less malt, more water, but it's still nourishing, still safe, still made with care. You stir the mash slowly, your hands less clumsy now. It's starting to feel like second nature. You can almost time the steps by the smells. Toasted grain, wet straw, rising heat. You glance out the open window and see one of the lay sisters non-cloistered, still part of the community, chatting with a group of children at the gate. She hands each one a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Bread likely. Maybe a jug of small beer, too. Convents weren't isolated ivory towers. Many were deeply woven into their towns and villages. They offered alms, shelter, basic medical care, and, yes, beer. Brewing for charity was common, and in some cases expected. There's a famous case of a convent in Burgundy that brewed 4 kinds of ale, one for the sisters, one for the workers, one for the guests, and one for the poor. Guess which was the weakest. Still, even that weak beer could be life-saving in an age when a sip of unfiltered river water could knock you into the afterlife before Vespers. You watch as the cooled wort is poured into barrels destined for the outer kitchens, where meals are prepared for anyone who shows up hungry. Sister Hilda pats one of them like an old friend. "Drink this," she says, "and you'll get through a cold night with all your teeth." It's a joke. Kind of. Tooth decay was rampant, but beer's gentle acidity and lack of sugar actually made it safer than a lot of medieval options. Add to that the fact that it was usually consumed from personal mugs, less sharing, fewer germs, and it starts to make sense why it became such a default beverage. A tiny novice passes you carrying a jug that sloshes faintly as she walks. She offers you a crooked smile. You realize she can't be more than 11, and she's already navigating the brewing rota like she was born to it. "First pour's always cloudy," she says cheerfully, and disappears down the hall. You're beginning to see it now, the layers. This isn't just industry, it's identity. Brewing was something these women passed down like psalms. Each jug an offering, each barrel a blessing. You help lift the lighter casks onto a waiting cart. They'll be rolled down to the gate by evening, handed off to the village porter with a signed note from the abbess. Yes, even beer delivery required paperwork. As the day wears on, you sit by the hearth and talk with one of the older nuns, Sister Matilda, nearly blind but sharper than vinegar. She tells you about her early years in the brewhouse, before arthritis made her hang up her mash paddle. She speaks of a time when one batch went sour because a batch of herbs had been left too close to the heat. "We didn't throw it out," she grins. "We served it to the bishop, called it penance ale. He drank the whole jug without complaint." You laugh, but you also tuck that story away. Every convent had its mishaps, some accidental, some, perhaps, not so accidental. There's a curious tale from a 14th century English priory where the brewing sisters were reprimanded for excessive enthusiasm. One historian interprets that as a euphemism for drunkenness. Another claims they were simply sneaking the strong batch for themselves while offering the watery dregs to visiting monks. Historians still argue whether nuns ever truly got drunk on their own supply. Some say no too much discipline. Others point to records of disciplinary notes, including one where a sister was caught dancing merrily in the garden after the feast of St. Agnes. The record doesn't clarify what was in her cup, but it's not hard to guess. Sister Hilda joins you by the fire just as the rain lets up. The barrels are gone, the hearth is warm, and the scent of freshly rinsed wood fills the room. She pours you a half cup of the charity ale thinner, yes, but with a clean, floral taste. Calendula? Maybe. Or elderflower. You drink slowly, grateful for every strange, sleepy, sacred part of this life. By now, you've developed a nose for it. Not just for the beer, but for the rhythm, the way a brewing day unfurls like a chant. First the mash, then the boil, the cool, the ferment, the waiting. Always the waiting. But today, you're not in the brewhouse. Not yet. You're in the herbarium. It's a quiet little room near the convent's southern wall, warm from sunlit windows and smelling like crushed mint and dusty pages. Wooden racks line the walls, each holding small cloth bundles or ceramic jars labeled in tidy Latin script. You spot chamomile, mugwort, wormwood, thyme, hyssop, and one called Mother's Curse, which you don't dare open without supervision. Sister Cecilia oversees this space. She's thin as a barley stalk and moves like a whisper. She doesn't speak much, but when she hands you a mortar and pestle, you understand your task is to grind a handful of dried herbs for today's brew. You'll want it fine, she murmurs, but not powdered, just enough to wake the scent. She watches you carefully as you begin to crush the mixture, mostly yarrow and rosemary, with a hint of something citrusy. It smells sharp, green, and vaguely medicinal. This isn't just for flavor. This is the Groot. Before hops became the global standard for beer, brewers used herbal blends known as gruit to flavor and preserve their ale. And who had access to the herbs? Nuns, who grew them, dried them, stored them, and understood them better than anyone in town. Also nuns. In fact, in some regions, Groot rights were tightly controlled. Whole towns had to buy their herb blends from licensed vendors, or, in rare cases, from monastic communities with the knowledge and the gardens to back it up. You add the Groot to a small cloth sachet and carry it back to the brewhouse, where the day's wort is just starting to steam in its wide copper cauldron. Sister Hilda nods when she sees the bundle. "Good nose," she says. "That'll make it sing." You lower the sachet into the bubbling liquid like a tea bag, and within seconds, the scent changes less grainy, more resinous, woodsy, even. It reminds you of pine forests and old books. "Let it steep," Hilda says. "We'll pull it before the boil ends. Let it speak, but don't let it shout." You lean against a barrel and sip yesterday's small beer, now fully fermented and faintly fizzy. It tastes brighter than the last batch, thanks, no doubt, to that magic sachet. Historians still argue whether Groot ales were better than hopped ales. Some insist the herbs offered more complexity: floral, bitter, spicy. Others point out that hops were simply easier to standardize and preserve, making them more commercially viable. But nuns weren't commercial, they were personal. Each convent's blend was unique, adjusted season by season, often kept secret. There's a tale, half folk legend, half plausible truth, of a convent in Flanders where the Groot recipe was hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. Only the abbess and the brew nun knew it. When both died in a particularly unfortunate bout of stomach fever, the secret went with them. The town's beer was never the same. Back in the brewhouse, the wort finishes boiling. You help strain it through cloth into the cooling trays. Sister Hilda lets you take the Groot sachet out. It's stained deep brown and smells like a potion. You toss it onto the compost pile, where it lands with a damp plop next to discarded hop cones from a previous batch. That's right, some convents used hops too, especially by the 14th and 15th centuries, as their popularity spread across Europe. Hops added bitterness, balance, and most importantly, preservative qualities. A hopped beer could last longer without souring. But not everyone loved them at first. Some abbesses complained that hops made beer too bitter. Others worried they were too masculine and herb, an odd phrase that shows up in a few cloister records. One even claimed hops disturbed the humors and increased restlessness. You're not sure if that's a bad thing or just a better party. Still, over time, hops won. In many regions, Groot fell out of fashion or was outright banned by brewing guilds looking to standardize recipes. But in your sleepy little convent, the herbs live on, quietly, patiently, like the sisters themselves. As you clean up, Sister Hilda hands you a small cup of experimental ale. It's been aging in a clay jug for 3 days and contains a mix of sage, wild fennel, and elderflower. You take a sip. It's strange, beautiful, like drinking a meadow after rain. You close your eyes and let it rest on your tongue. This, you think, is what people forget, that beer was once wild, that brewing was a deeply tactile, living thing, not formulaic, not sterile, but emotional, seasonal, tangled up in memory and ritual and the soft crunch of herbs underfoot. You help seal today's batch in barrels. Sister Hilda labels them with a chalk symbol: simple, fast, unassuming. You ask what it means. She shrugs. That's the mark we use for herbal brews. It's older than me. Older than the convent. Maybe. Probably. It's just what we do. That's the thing here. So much of this isn't written down. It's lived, remembered in hands and habits. A line of knowledge passed from sister to sister, like a torch or a warm wooden spoon. By the time the sun sets, your nose is filled with 100 overlapping scents. You dream, that night, of green hills, sage fires, and beer that blooms like spring. And in some corner of the convent, the Groot does its quiet work turning sweet liquid into something deeper. By now, you know your way to the brewhouse without even thinking. Down the covered walkway, past the fig tree with the perpetually grumpy crow, left at the chipped statue of Saint Scholastica. And there it is, the heartbeat of the convent. But today, you don't walk in. You're summoned somewhere new. Sister Hilda finds you before you've even had a chance to finish your morning hunk of bread. She looks you up and down like she's inspecting a turnip at market, then hands you a folded apron, clean and white. You're shadowing the abbess. You freeze mid-chew. The abbess, she brews. Hilda smirks. The abbess runs everything, including the beer. And with that, you're dismissed. You've only seen the abbess once before from a respectful distance, during Vespers. A tall, composed figure, with a face like someone who could find the flaws in a cathedral wall with one glance. Now, she waits for you in the convent's inner garden, seated beneath an arch of climbing roses, sipping what you suspect is not her first cup of ale today. She gestures for you to sit, then she speaks quietly, but with a sharpness that tells you she's not someone used to repeating herself. "Tell me," she says, "what's the difference between a bad beer and a sinful one?" You blink. This is a test. One tastes terrible, the other leads to ruin. She lifts an eyebrow, then smiles, not warmly. Exactly, but not unkindly either. Close enough. And just like that, your lesson begins. Because here's something you hadn't realized. Convent brewing isn't just kettles and grain. It's management, inventory, storage, accounting, politics. The abbess, as it turns out, is less a holy recluse and more a quiet operations commander with a deep knowledge of every barrel on the premises. She walks you through the cellar, lined with rows of aging ale in clay and oak. Some barrels are tapped. Some are sealed with wax. Each one is marked with an elegant script, noting batch, date, and destination. She explains how the beer is rotated, which ones are for the sisters, which are sent to the guest house, which go to the poorhouse, and which carefully, discreetly, are sold to local merchants. That's right, convent beer turned a profit. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially during the High Middle Ages, nunneries were allowed to sell surplus beer, not just for survival, but to fund repairs, charity efforts, even manuscript production. Beer paid for candles, for ink, for linen robes and medical herbs. It wasn't greedy, it was practical. And in some convents, brewing was so successful that it drew attention from less than charitable parties, local brewing guilds, jealous monasteries, and even bishops with suspiciously expensive tastes. You pause beside a cask labeled with a red wax seal. The abbess taps it lightly with her ring. That, she says, is our best, saved for feast days, or for very generous patrons. She doesn't say donors, she says patrons. There's a difference. These were people who kept the convent running. Yes, but they also expected their cup to be full when they visited. Historians still debate how much influence wealthy supporters had over nunnery brewing practices. Some believe they subtly encouraged more luxurious ales. Others argue that abbesses kept a tight rein, balancing generosity with spiritual discipline. The truth, as always, likely fell somewhere in between. You climb down into the lowest cellar, cool, shadowy, with stone walls that smell like time itself. The abbess gestures to a corner lined with cracked barrels. Over-fermented, she says simply. Too warm. The yeast rose too fast. No use now. You ask if they'll toss it out. Never, she replies. We distill it. For tinctures or vinegar, nothing is wasted. You realize, in that moment, how deliberate every part of the operation is. Not just in the brewing, but in how the convent survives. Every drop of ale has a role. Every cask a purpose. It's not just about the liquid, it's about the system. And the abbess, she's the master brewer of that whole invisible machine. She leads you back up to her study, a room filled with scrolls, wax tablets, and ledgers. You spot a brewing log on the table. Neat columns, careful notes. A separate page lists costs and returns for the past season, grain, water, herbs, labor, vessel maintenance, and gross income from ale sold at the town market. She lets you skim it. It's modest, but solid. And more importantly, it's hers, the convent's, a product of quiet labor and steady hands, not divine miracles, just centuries of women working, learning, and passing on what they knew. There's a knock at the door. A lay sister brings in 2 small cups on a tray convent ale, mid-strength, dark, with a soft foamy head. The abbess takes one and gestures for you to do the same. You sit, you sip. It's delicious. Nutty, faintly sweet, with an herbal echo you can't quite place. Something like thyme, but rounder, fuller. You ask what's in it. She chuckles. Wouldn't you like to know? You both drink in silence for a moment. Then she says, almost casually, tomorrow, you'll return to Sister Hilda. You've seen what you needed to see. You nod, unsure if this was a lesson or an initiation. As you stand to leave, she adds, brewing isn't just fire and grain, it's balance, order, timing. She doesn't say discipline. She doesn't need to. You exit back into the cloister, the evening sun catching in the glass of your empty cup. And somewhere behind you, the abbess returns to her ledgers, quietly ensuring that the convent, its sisters, and its brewing will endure another season. You return to the brewhouse at dawn like someone who's just visited a mountaintop oracle. Sister Hilda's waiting, arms crossed, apron already dusty. She raises an eyebrow. Well, she says, did the abbess teach you how to levitate your barrels with divine wisdom? You snort? She taught me about inventory. Hilda grins, clearly pleased. Good, then you can start by counting these. She gestures behind her. It's a stack of barrels, at least 20, maybe more, each marked with a chalk scrawl, all needing to be checked, rotated, and, if you're very unlucky, refilled. And so you begin? What you realize, fairly quickly, is that the convent's brewing operation isn't just about keeping nuns hydrated and pilgrims cheerful. It's about sustainability, literal, physical survival, not just for the sisters, but for everyone who depends on the community, the townsfolk, the laborers, the guests at the gates. Each barrel tells a story. One is half full and smells faintly sharp. It's starting to sour on purpose, according to Sister Hilda, who plans to mix it with herbs and honey to make something closer to a proto-ale punch. For the feast of St. Helena, she says, she was martyred with a shepherd's crook. Deserves a bit of kick. Another barrel contains a cloudy brew that she claims was fermented too quickly. Makes you feel like you're floating after just one mug, she mutters, not in a holy way. Still, they'll use it. Because beer isn't wasted here, not even when it's weird, strong, or too herbal. It's repurposed, redistilled, dried into barley cakes, or boiled into syrup. Some barrels even end up in the kitchen, where beer becomes broth, or glaze, or something suspiciously like dessert. You're assigned to one of the trickier tasks transferring ale from an old, cracked cask into a fresh barrel. It's a slow process, done with care, using cloth filters to catch any bits of grain or sediment. You work in silence for a while, then Sister Hilda breaks it with a question. Did she tell you about the ledger? You nod. She showed me. Hilda chuckles. Good. Then you understand. Brewing's not just sacred. It's political. You look up. People assume the abbess just prays all day, she says, but she has to negotiate with merchants, balance taxes, decide how much beer we keep and how much we sell. Every jug that leaves the convent is a message. A message. She wipes her hands on her apron. A weak ale says we're humble. A strong one says we're thriving. And a spoiled one says we're not watching. You hadn't thought of it that way, but it makes sense. In a world where few women had economic power, the abbess used beer as leverage, influence, currency. Historians still argue how much political clout abbesses really had. Some say they were mere figureheads, ruled over by bishops and kings. Others point to letters, contracts, and surviving records that show abbesses acting as landowners, negotiators, and yes, chief brewmasters. One particularly spicy tale comes from a 13th century convent near Cologne, where an abbess famously refused to pay the local bishop's ale tax. She claimed that since the beer was brewed for holy purposes, it should be exempt. He sent a letter of protest. She sent him 3 barrels of her strongest ale with a note that read, "May this soften your heart, and if not, your spine." Nobody knows how he responded, but the tax disappeared. You finish the transfer, hammer in the stopper, and mark the barrel with the date and a simple star. Sister Hilda nods in approval. Go on, she says. You've earned a cup. You fill a mug from the latest batch, mild, honeyed, a bit grassy. It goes down easy. As you sit on the edge of a crate, sipping slowly, Hilda sits beside you and begins to wrap twine around bundles of dried herbs. It's a quiet moment, but not awkward. Just the soft kind of silence that settles in after good work. She tells you about a nun who once tried to flavor a whole batch with rose petals. Smelled like heaven, she says. Tasted like soap. You laugh. She shrugs. She was trying something new. That's the thing about brewing. You follow the rules until you don't. Then you write new ones. You've been hearing that a lot. from the abbess, from Sister Matilda, from the novices. This quiet current beneath all the ritual and repetition experimentation. Curiosity? And in this moment, it strikes you these women weren't just copying recipes, they were innovating, adjusting for bad harvests, strange weather, new herbs, changing palates. Every batch was a risk, every improvement, a legacy. You finish your cup and help carry the fresh barrel to the aging room. It joins a dozen others lined against the stone wall, their wooden staves glistening slightly from the humid air. You ask Sister Hilda how long they'll age. Some for a week, she says, some for a season, some, if we're lucky, until we're too old to remember brewing them. She pauses, then adds, and one or two, until the abbess says otherwise. You leave the room quietly, letting the barrels sit in their dark, cool stillness. Back in the courtyard, the sun is high, and the grumpy crow has moved from the fig tree to the roof, where it glares at everyone without blinking. You think about how much you've learned? How brewing, here, is a thread that connects everything faith, economics, medicine, memory. And how the abbess and Sister Hilda, in their own ways, are weaving that thread into something sturdy, something that holds. You take another deep breath. It smells like fermenting grain, rosemary, and old wood. It smells like survival. Today, the brewhouse is unusually quiet. Not silent. Of course, there's always the soft hiss of simmering mash, the squeak of barrels being shifted, the distant hum of chant from the chapel, but the usual bustle is missing. Sister Hilda is gone, called away to help with preparations for a visiting bishop. You're on your own. Well, almost. Sister Agnes has been assigned to supervise you. She's younger than Hilda, bookish, and slightly allergic to yeast. You spend the morning watching her sneeze daintily into her sleeve between instructions. Your task is one of the most important and most uncelebrated in the entire brewing cycle: cleaning. You're scrubbing barrels. Not the fun kind of scrubbing, with soap and cheery humming. No, this is the deep, slow, shoulder-aching kind of scrubbing, where you lower yourself into the wide bellies of the wooden casks and scrape out the gunk left behind by fermentation. It's not glamorous, it's not poetic, but without it, the beer turns. Sister Agnes hands you a bundle of stiff bristles and a bowl of vinegar mixed with thyme. The vinegar cleans. The thyme masks the smell, barely. As you work, she explains the importance of sanitation in brewing, a subject that would make modern microbiologists blink in surprise. Most convents didn't know why beer spoiled, she says, but they knew how to prevent it. Hot water, fresh herbs, regular scrubbing, airtight seals. It wasn't sterile, not in the clinical sense, but it was intentional, attentive. And that's the secret. Beer, more than anything, is sensitive. It reacts to mood, to weather, to time. If you leave a barrel uncleaned, it remembers. If you seal it too early, it sulks. If you whisper kindly to it, well, that might just be superstition. But in a convent, even superstition gets a turn. You ask her how often barrels are replaced. Depends on the wood, she says. Oak lasts longest. Ash is too soft. We had one made of elm once. It leaked like a penitent's confession. There's a pause, then a sneeze. You return to work, amused, and think about how much of brewing is physical labor, and how that labor was often dismissed when performed by women. Historians still argue whether nun brewers were taken seriously outside the cloister. Some suggest their expertise was acknowledged, at least locally, especially when their beer outperformed the town's. Others believe they were seen as hobbyists, their work valued only so long as it didn't interfere with male-dominated brewing guilds. Which brings us to something curious. You're rinsing a cloth when Sister Agnes glances around, lowers her voice, and says, "Did you know we're not supposed to be doing this?" You blink? Cleaning barrels? She smirks. Brewing? Then she explains, in many towns, especially by the late Middle Ages, brewing had become guild-controlled, and guilds were overwhelmingly male. They set the rules, regulated sales, and decided who could brew legally. In some cities, even convents weren't exempt. They had to petition for permission, pay dues, or prove their ales were for internal use only. But convents, being convents, found ways around this. One method: brew just inside the legal threshold for personal consumption, and then just happen to have extra. Another trade beer for favors, not coins. A few barrels for the baker, who brings extra flour, one for the stonemason, who repairs the crumbling east wall. Everyone gets what they need, and no one has to mention money. And some convents, well, they simply ignored the rules. There's a record from a priory near Bruges where the brewing nuns were fined repeatedly by the local guild. They paid once, then stopped responding. The fines stacked up. Eventually, the guild gave up. You ask Sister Agnes how this convent handled it. She shrugs. We're far enough from the town center, and the abbess is persuasive. You get the sense persuasive is a polite way of saying unflinchingly terrifying in negotiations. Still, it highlights the odd space convents occupied caught between religious duty and economic survival, navigating a male-dominated system with soft voices and sharp strategy. As the barrels dry in the sun, you move to another task, checking the wooden spigots. These are hand-carved, slightly leaky, and essential to tapping the barrels without contaminating the brew. Each one must be sanded smooth, oiled lightly, and tested for cracks. You work with care, learning the grain of the wood. Sister Agnes watches approvingly. Attention, she says, is a kind of prayer. You smile. You've heard that before from Hilda, from Matilda, even from the abbess. It's starting to make sense. Because while monks get most of the brewing credit in history books, Trappist ales, abbey ales, beer brewed in stone monasteries with ornate labels, nuns were doing the work too, quietly, carefully, in smaller batches, with less recognition, but no less skill. Some scholars now argue that the lack of surviving records isn't proof of absence, it's proof of erasure. Female brewers simply weren't seen as significant by those who wrote the histories. Their names were lost, their methods absorbed, their barrels, eventually, rebranded. But if you listen closely in the creak of old wood, in the rhythm of rinsing cloth, in the herbal sweetness clinging to the walls, you can still feel them. Still brewing, still praying, still stubborn. You finish the last barrel just as the sun dips behind the convent walls. Sister Agnes hands you a cup, modest, pale, slightly sour. A tester batch, she says, brewed with a new mix of herbs. You sip. It's bright, surprising, a little strange. You like it. You drink slowly, watching the light fade through the high arched windows, where dust floats like incense in the amber air. And somewhere, faint but steady, the chapel bells begin to ring. The bells are still echoing faintly as you return to the main walkway, mug in hand, when you notice something unusual. The outer gates are open. This doesn't happen often. Convent gates tend to stay closed physically and metaphorically. They keep the world out, and the world, wisely, keeps its distance. But today, the world has come in. You follow the scent of travel dust and boiled cabbage to the front courtyard, where a line of weary pilgrims is being welcomed by two lay sisters with calloused hands and patient eyes, cloaks soaked with rain, feet wrapped in strips of linen, eyes red from wind and long roads. Pilgrims. They're younger than you'd imagined, older, too, a mix of ages, faces, languages. Some are limping, some are singing, one is asleep on his feet, another clutches a wooden icon to his chest like it's the only thing that got him this far. And the nuns, they greet them like old friends. One of the sisters pushes a cart forward. On it, small clay mugs, bread, soup, and yes, beer. Because when pilgrims arrived at a convent in the Middle Ages, they weren't just offered prayers. They were offered ale. Not a fancy brew, not the abbess's private stash, but a warm, nourishing cup of small beer mild, lightly fermented, and more important than gold when you've walked 50 miles without clean water. You help distribute mugs. The beer is thinner than the batch you tried yesterday, but it has a grassy sweetness and a little zing, maybe lemon balm, maybe something else. It tastes like rest. One pilgrim nods at you between sips. Better than the tavern in Mainz, he mutters. You don't tell him you had a hand in stirring it, but you smile. And you start to realize this beer, this humble, cloudy mug, is part of the convent's hospitality system. Not a luxury, a lifeline. Hospices, almshouses, roadside inns, they all existed, but convents often stood as the last true safety net for the poor, the sick, the wandering, and beer was their currency of compassion. Historians estimate that some larger nunneries provided shelter and ale to hundreds of pilgrims per year, especially those traveling to major shrines like Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome. Some even had dedicated brewing days just for visitor ale lighter, quicker to make, easier to distribute. And it wasn't just drink. The nuns checked feet, dressed wounds, sang soft psalms while applying poultices of chamomile and vinegar. One novice near you is currently rubbing a man's swollen ankles with rosemary oil. Her touch gentle, her sleeves rolled up past the elbows of her habit. Not every visitor is grateful. One man complains loudly that the beer is watered down. Sister Hilda, who has reappeared like a storm cloud, hands him a fresh mug with a blank smile. Next time, she says, bring your own brewery. You swear you hear one of the novices snort into her veil. But most pilgrims drink slowly, reverently. They know what this is. A sacred pause, a soft space between hard miles. And beer, somehow, is part of the blessing. There's even an old phrase in the convent ledger, to brew is to welcome. You learn that some nunneries kept special records of their visitors, who they were, where they came from, how long they stayed, and sometimes what they drank. One 14th century entry reads, "The Italian knight favored the darker cask, asked if it were brewed from chestnuts. We said yes, it was not." These records weren't just ledgers, they were memory books, proof that the nuns saw the people who passed through each one a little miracle of survival, a living story between destinations. As the evening wears on, the pilgrims settle into spare cots in the guest dormitory. The younger ones lean against the walls, sharing road stories. You catch fragments. A bridge washed out in Lorraine, a miracle spring near Avignon, a cow that followed one of them for 3 days and then vanished. You don't know how much is true, but that's not the point. Pilgrims trade stories like monks trade psalms, each tale a little comfort, each sip a little salvation. One old woman, wrapped in 3 shawls and smelling like nettles, tells you she once visited a convent in Brittany, where the nuns made beer from rye and dried apples. It fizzed, she whispers, like it was laughing. You promise to ask Sister Hilda about that one. The last of the mugs are gathered. The cart is wheeled away. The cloister returns to stillness. But you sit by the door a while longer, listening to the soft shuffle of bedrolls and the sighs of people who, for tonight at least, are safe. You think about what it means to brew for others, to make something that nourishes strangers you'll never see again, to offer a drink instead of a sermon. You think about the hands that grew the grain, stirred the mash, watched the yeast bubble and foam. And you realize this beer isn't just an old drink, it's a kindness. The kind that has walked beside people for centuries, through cold nights, long roads, aching bones, and broken shoes. Always there, always waiting. In barrels, in hands, in convents where the doors open, even just a little, to let the world come rest. The pilgrims are gone by morning. You watch them from the gate quiet, dusty shapes shrinking down the road, their mugs returned, their packs slightly heavier with bread and dried fruit. A few wave. One leaves a sprig of rosemary on the doorstep. No words, just a gesture. You tuck it behind your ear and head back inside. The convent feels emptier without them, but not in a lonely way, in a reset kind of way, like a breath being drawn in again. Sister Hilda finds you reorganizing the drying racks and grunts approval before handing you a new task. "Feast brew," she says. "Today's the day." You blink? "Feast?" She smirks. "Did you think we only made boring beer?" She leads you to a smaller room off the brewhouse, where ingredients are stacked in neat little piles. Spices, dried orange peel, crushed almonds, honey, even, yes, raisins. This is special occasion ale. And not just any occasion. The feast of St. Hildegard is coming up, patroness of nuns, mystics, herbalists, and, rather fittingly, of brewing. You help prepare the mash as usual, but this time it's richer. The grain has been roasted longer, and the herbs are more fragrant. There's a trace of cinnamon in the air, and the honey is being gently warmed in a pot beside the fire, stirred by a novice with the kind of focus usually reserved for prayers. You ask Sister Hilda how often the nuns get to enjoy something like this. "Only a few times a year," she says. "Feast days, founding anniversaries, maybe a bishop's visit if we like him." She pauses. "We rarely like them." Still, the brewing on feast days is different, not just in ingredients, but in atmosphere. The air feels lighter. There's quiet laughter, a hum of anticipation. Because in the monastic calendar, feast days were moments of release. Permission to smile a little wider, to eat a little better, to drink a little deeper. Even the rules bend on feast days. Silence is relaxed, fasting lifted. The psalms are sung with a touch more melody. And the beer? It's celebratory. Richer, stronger, brewed with joy. You stir the pot and notice the scent has changed again. Darker, sweeter, with a sharp edge from the herbs. It smells like stories waiting to be told. Historians still debate whether feast day beers were significantly stronger than daily batches. Some claim they were modest tweaks, more honey, maybe a pinch of clove. Others argue the ale was deliberately boozy, brewed as both indulgence and celebration. What's certain is that the recipes varied wildly. One English convent added fig syrup and fennel. A German nunnery swore by black pepper and rose petals. A record from a Spanish priory mentions saffron, though scholars suspect that was a translation error or a very bold culinary experiment. Sister Hilda, for her part, sticks to the local flavor sweet gale, ground coriander, and toasted nuts. She says it pairs well with the rye bread they bake for the occasion. You ask if the abbess approves of the extra strength. She raises a brow. She does. She also pretends not to notice when the novices sneak an extra cup. Feast days come with selective vision. As the brew boils, you help prepare the casks. These are smaller barrels, easier to carry, with decorative lids carved with vines and tiny wheat stalks. A few are painted with saints' symbols, a wheel, a harp, a lily. You learn that each cask has a name. Not every batch, Hilda clarifies, just the feast ones. She points to a squat barrel labeled Clara. That one always leaks a little, but she tries hard. And another Judith the Bold, nearly exploded last Pentecost. We keep her cool now. You think about how even the tools here have personalities, histories, Nicknames passed from one sister to the next, like whispered jokes. There's something deeply human about it all. When the boiling finishes, the ale is cooled in shallow trays, the scent now full and round. You dip a spoon in, taste the first clear sip of wort. It's wonderful. Sweet and herbal, with a richness that settles at the back of your throat like a warm secret. Sister Hilda tastes it, nods once, and lets it cool further before transferring it to the waiting barrels. Tomorrow, the yeast will be added and the fermentation will begin. But tonight, the sisters gather in the courtyard, lanterns lit, and sing a soft hymn to Saint Hildegard. No one says the word party, but the atmosphere shifts. The kitchen smells like something baking. The chapel doors are flung open. Even the grumpy crow seems to be in a slightly better mood. One of the older nuns begins playing a psaltery near the herb garden. Another claps along, offbeat but cheerful. A novice sneaks a spoonful of honey and gets mock scolded. You sit with your back against the brewhouse wall, mug in hand, and watch it all unfold. The laughter, the gentle music, the soft glint of candlelight on cooling ale. This is what they work for. Not the daily rations, not the quiet charity, but these nights brief and glowing when everyone breathes a little easier and remembers that joy, too, is sacred. One of the sisters offers you a taste of the last feast's ale, still aging in the cellar. You take a sip and taste spice and fruit and something like toasted almonds. You raise your cup toward the brewhouse and whisper, "To Judith the Bold." And somewhere inside the cask, the beer settles a little more deeply. By morning, the courtyard still hums with traces of celebration. A forgotten ribbon hangs from the herb trellis. Someone's left a crust of honey bread near the fountain, half-eaten and humming with bees. You think you hear a novice still humming St. Hildegard's hymn while sweeping the walk. But inside the brewhouse, the mood is back to business. Today, the yeast goes in? You find Sister Hilda waiting by the fermentation trays, sleeves already rolled, face grim with concentration. You've seen her handle hot kettles and boiling wort without blinking, but this makes her nervous. Because this is the part no one can fully control. Adding yeast isn't like adding water or grain, it's a leap of faith. And in the Middle Ages, it was mystery incarnate. They didn't know it was a microorganism, didn't know it was alive. In the way we understand today, they just knew that if you left cooled wort exposed to the right air or added a bit of leftover mash from a successful batch, something would happen. Bubbles, foam, heat, life. They called it God is good, God is good. And in this convent, they mean that literally. Sister Hilda opens a small clay jar and gently scoops out a paste-like substance, slightly yellow, sour-smelling, clinging to the spoon like wet dough. This is the mother. Not your mother, the mother. The yeast carried over from previous brews, treasured, fed, guarded like a relic. Its lineage may go back decades. She adds it slowly, stirring as she goes, and you watch as the liquid begins to shift, slowly, gently, like it knows something is coming alive. You help cover the trays with cloth and whisper a short psalm, one the sisters use to bless the brew. It's not required, but it helps. And now, you wait. Fermentation takes days, sometimes longer. It's not a dramatic process, but it's crucial. Without it, you just have sweet grain soup. With it, you get beer. So today, you turn your attention elsewhere, to something even more sacred. In some ways, the taste-off. Yes, you read that right. Every few weeks, the convent samples batches from different days, different herbs, different techniques. They don't call it quality control. That's too worldly. They call it discernment. The sisters gather in the dining hall. A line of clay cups is set out, each labeled with chalk symbols or abbreviated dates. A novice reads the entries aloud like she's calling out psalms. You sit at the end of the row with Sister Matilda, the nearly blind elder with a memory sharper than a scythe. She sniffs her cup, nods slowly. Ah, wormwood. We tried that last Lent. Aggressive. You take a sip. She's right. It's like being punched in the sinuses by a minty ghost. The next one is softer. Elderflower. Maybe a hint of oat. One sister suggests adding lemon balm next time. Another says it's perfect as is. Every comment is noted. Every sip evaluated not for marketing potential, but for harmony. This beer isn't meant to impress tavern-goers. It's meant to nourish bodies, balance humors, and ideally not cause anyone to hallucinate unless it's on a saint's feast day. Still, mistakes happen. One batch from the winter has turned sharp. Nearly vinegar. Sister Hilda calls it discipline ale and threatens to serve it to any novice who skips prayers. You suggest using it to clean the cloister floor. She doesn't say no. As the taste-off winds down, you notice something lovely. Every sister, regardless of age or rank, gets a say. The abbess sips and listens just like the novices do. It's democratic, communal, monastic in the best sense. Even the bad brews get respect. Because they teach. Historians still debate whether medieval nunneries wrote down formal brewing recipes. Some argue, yes, careful records were kept, passed down like illuminated scrolls. Others say no, it was all oral tradition, sensory memory, touch and taste passed hand to hand. Truthfully, it was probably both. This convent seems to hold both ways in tension. There's a brewing log in the abbess's study. Yes, but there's also the taste in Sister Matilda's tongue, the stir of Hilda's hand, the way novices whisper to each other about which barrel sings and which one sleeps. And then there's you. You're no expert. You still forget which herbs are which. You sometimes stir the mash too fast or let the barley soak too long, but you're learning. Because here, brewing isn't just technique. It's instinct, memory, community. After the tasting, you help return the mugs to the kitchen. A few sisters linger, trading notes, laughing softly. You catch a snippet of conversation about a batch that once turned blue. No one knows why. They called it Heaven's Surprise. It was never repeated. Later that evening, you check the fermentation trays. Bubbles rise softly through the brew, not frantic, not foamy, just steady. It's working. The yeast, this strange, unseen, holy thing, is transforming the grainy sweetness into something deeper, something stronger. You smile and close the lid gently. You think of all the things the nuns brew here: healing beer, feast beer, pilgrim beer, teaching beer, oops, it went sideways beer. You think of how each cup holds not just ingredients, but intention. And you think, as the bells ring softly through the dusk, that maybe you're fermenting too. It's a cloudy morning, heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. You're helping Sister Hilda check the fermenting trays when a novice bursts in, breathless, clutching a folded letter. From the bishop's steward, she pants. He's inspecting. Hilda groans. Again. Apparently, this isn't the first time. You learn quickly that not everyone is thrilled about the convent's brewing success. While the townsfolk are happy enough to sip and trade, and the pilgrims sing its praises down the road, certain figures higher up the ecclesiastical ladder are less enthusiastic. Too much merriment, they whisper. Too much trade. Too much flavor. You raise an eyebrow at Hilda, who mutters, they'd prefer we brewed sermons. The inspection is scheduled for 2 days from now, which means the next 48 hours are a whirlwind of scrubbing, inventory checking, and discreetly hiding anything that might suggest the nuns enjoy what they do a little too much. Sister Matilda is tasked with guarding the strong ale. You find her sitting in front of a locked cask with a stool and a ladle like she's ready for war. I'll let him in, she says cheerfully, but I'll bore him into repentance first. Despite the nerves, there's a quiet sense of defiance in the air. This isn't the first time convents have had to hide their pleasures under layers of piety. There's a long and peculiar history of religious brewing meeting resistance. In some dioceses, ale production by women nuns, or otherwise, was frowned upon, too secular, too loud, too fun. Some bishops issued edicts forbidding nuns from selling their beer at market. Others demanded it be watered down to reflect proper modesty. One convent in Austria reportedly received a formal rebuke for boiling beer with too much enthusiasm, whatever that means. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were about morality or simply control. Brewing brought in income and power, and where power flows, so do politics. You see it now, how every barrel, every ladle, every sip is part of a bigger game. The morning of the inspection arrives gray and drizzly. The steward appears at the gate on a tall horse with a wet cloak and the expression of someone who's recently argued with a mule. He announces himself in Latin, then repeats it in louder Latin, which still doesn't help. He's escorted in, given a warm meal, and then brought reluctantly to the brewhouse. He sniffs the air like it offends him. Sister Hilda greets him with all the warmth of cold porridge. "This is the mash tun," she says, smacking the side of the great kettle. "She's older than you and twice as useful." You stand beside her, trying not to laugh. The steward walks slowly, peering into barrels, frowning at drying herbs, and occasionally asking questions he doesn't understand the answers to. "What's this? Fermenting? Is it supposed to bubble?" "Yes." "Ah." He makes notes, in very small handwriting. You suspect he may be doodling. Sister Hilda guides him to the cooler barrels, all clearly labeled for internal use. No mention of the abbess's side ledger. No mention of the barrels marked Judith the Bold and Heaven's Surprise tucked in the far cellar. He asks if the nuns drink ale daily. "Only when awake," Hilda says sweetly. He blinks. Later, you find him wandering alone, mug in hand, pretending not to sip. You don't mention it. After he leaves, the convent exhales. You help Sister Hilda mop the stone floor, which has been polished to a reflective shine. She leans on the broom like it's a walking staff. "They don't care that we brew," she says. "They care that we brew well." You nod. You understand now? Because brewing at this level isn't just sustenance. It's an art, a skill. And when women practice something skillfully, quietly, consistently, communally, it unnerves people. You learn later that the steward's report included the phrase "appropriate modesty observed," which the abbess reads aloud with a smirk. Still, she tucks it into the ledger, because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is play along, on paper, at least. In secret, you keep brewing. You help Hilda experiment with a new batch dried pear, coriander, and a twist of black pepper. Too odd for the main stock, she says, but let's see what it wants to be. You stir, taste, adjust, let it ferment. You've started hearing the sisters refer to certain brews by feeling, not ingredients. This one feels like spring rain. That one's good for arguments. The one from last Tuesday sings a little when it's warm. And the thing is, they're not wrong. You've begun to sense it, too. What began as routine measuring, stirring, cooling has become something else. A way of listening, of noticing, of knowing when a brew is right. That night, you're invited to the novices' hallway for a low-key tasting. You sit on the stone floor beside the laundry room, passing around a single cup of a trial ale rosemary, oats, orange peel. You talk about whether it's too sharp, too flat, too sleepy. You don't resolve anything. But you finish the cup. And someone hums a hymn with the wrong words, and everyone laughs. And someone else whispers, "Shh, the abbess has ears like a bat." You stay there a while, listening to the yeast bubble in the casks below, the laughter echo in the cloister, the distant bells calling for compline. And you think not for the first time that these nuns aren't just brewers. They're alchemists of quiet resistance, turning grain into gold. And not asking permission. The abbess gives you a quiet nod as you pass her in the corridor the next morning. It's not a smile, but you feel it like one. No one says anything about the inspection anymore. It's already in the past. The barrels are still standing. The brewhouse is still warm, and fermentation continues, as it always does. Today, you're helping with something rarely discussed, but crucial to the entire operation. Architecture. Yes, brewing changes buildings. You didn't expect that either. But when Sister Hilda pulls you toward a side wing of the convent, narrow, shadowed, low-roofed, you realize there's a whole part of the structure you haven't seen. Small doorways, strange vents cut into the ceiling, a faint, sour scent baked into the stones. This, she says, waving her arm, used to be the old brewhouse. It's no longer in use, but everything's still here. The kettle stones, the brick hearth, the sloped floor for drainage. It looks more like a chapel for ale than a workshop, and it shows you something you hadn't truly grasped. Beer reshaped the convent. Literally. Nunneries that brewed regularly often expanded around the process. A small corner hearth became a dedicated brewhouse. Then came storage rooms, grain lofts, herb cellars. Some added roof vents to manage steam. Others constructed underground tunnels to keep casks cool. You've heard of at least one convent with a hidden chute that allowed the abbess to test beer straight from her chambers. Whether that's true or not, it captures the spirit. You help Hilda inventory what remains here: old tools, warped staves, a moldy ledger sealed in beeswax. She shows you the original fermentation troughs, long, shallow wooden boxes designed to cool the wort quickly before the yeast went in. You lean over one and imagine it bubbling again. The new brewhouse is better, of course larger, safer, more efficient, but there's something about this space that feels tender, historic, like a buried root still clinging to the soil. Hilda sees you staring and says, "Don't get too romantic. This place stank in summer." But her voice is fond. Historians still argue how much brewing influenced monastic architecture. Some point to specific structural adaptations, drainage channels, reinforced barrel rooms, heat-resistant stonework as evidence that beer was central to design. Others argue these were minor changes, incidental at best. You stand here now, inside a room shaped by ale, and you know which side you're on. From there, the day is a whirlwind of motion. You help sweep the newer brewhouse, then carry full casks into the lower cellar, each one marked with the saint's symbol for whom the brew was dedicated. There's even one with a tiny fish drawn in chalk. You ask, and Hilda says, "Feast of Saint Zeno, patron of fishermen. We add salt." You laugh. She doesn't. Apparently that's not a joke. Later, you're sent to the grain loft, a narrow wooden attic that smells like dust and old oats. You haul sacks into neat piles and are rewarded with a cool drink in the shade of the cloister wall. While resting, you talk with Sister Isabel, who oversees the kitchen garden. She tells you the hops growing out back were planted 5 abbesses ago, that the vines are so old, the roots reach beneath the cloister walls and try to sneak into the cemetery. "Saintly beer," she says, "direct from the bones." It's a joke. Probably. You visit the garden later and find the hops for yourself, spiraling lazily along a trellis. Green cones, heavy and fragrant. You crush one between your fingers and inhale. Bitter, bright, wild. Hops weren't always part of convent brewing. Before the 12th century, they were rare, even controversial. Some brewers resisted them, claiming they added unpleasant bitterness. Others praised them for their ability to preserve beer longer, reducing spoilage. Convents were often early adopters if they could grow them, and if the abbess was willing to risk the manly associations. One German abbess reportedly declared that hops were too rowdy for holy women and ordered her brew nuns to stick with yarrow and sage. That convent's beer went sour within the month. Coincidence? You don't think so. The day ends with you helping a novice seal a cracked cask with wax and pitch. She works with steady hands, her braid tucked beneath her veil, her sleeves rolled up. When you compliment her technique, she shrugs. Learned it from Sister Alex. She learned it from her aunt, who learned it from a nun in Rouen, who probably learned it from someone who wasn't a nun at all. You nod. It's another quiet truth here. Not all knowledge comes from within the convent. Some of it travels, over borders, through whispers, passed on from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, cook to nurse to novice to you. And while abbeys and monasteries had their rules, convents often found ways to bend them. You think back to the casks hidden during the steward's visit, the feast ales with names, the recipe tweaks no one records, but everyone remembers. You think of architecture reshaped by brewing. And you think this isn't just adaptation? It's evolution. By the end of the day, your arms ache, your clothes are dusty, and your boots smell faintly of hops. But the newest batch is bubbling along. The air feels warm. The convent hums. And under the floorboards, somewhere beneath the old brewhouse, a crooked little tunnel still runs between the kitchen and the cellar built, they say, to avoid spills in the rain. But you suspect it was just an easier way to sneak an extra cup of joy when the abbess wasn't looking. The day begins with a peculiar assignment. Sister Hilda hands you a cloth bundle and tells you to look reverent, which is usually a sign that you're about to do something extremely unreverent. You're heading to the town market, she says. Take these bottles. Don't drop them. Don't barter. Don't get distracted by musicians. You open the bundle's 6 small clay flasks, corked and sealed with red wax, each marked with the abbey's symbol, a modest sheaf of barley flanked by 2 stars. Feast ale! Specially brewed, carefully aged, and, technically, not for sale, but technically has a lot of wiggle room. You tuck the bundle under your cloak and head down the narrow lane that leads from the convent gates to the edge of town. The path is lined with low stone walls and bristly hedges. You pass a mill, a sleepy shepherd, and a black cat that ignores you completely. You wonder if anyone suspects that behind those quiet walls, the convent has become a quiet brewing powerhouse, or if they just think nuns pray so hard their water turns to ale. The market is lively, as markets always are. The smell of frying onions competes with wet wool. A boy sells eels in a barrel beside a woman hawking miracle ribbons. There's music, as Sister Hilda predicted. And yes, you get distracted. But only for a moment. You find the apothecary stall a wooden lean-to stacked with jars of dried herbs and sachets of powdered mushrooms. The woman behind it is old enough to be carved from oak. She takes one look at your bundle and nods. No words, she says, just a fair trade. You give her the ale, she gives you a pouch of dried rosemary, caraway, and a few mystery leaves wrapped in waxed linen. You don't ask questions. This is how it works. Because while nuns weren't allowed to sell beer, they could exchange it. And not always with coins. Sometimes it was herbs, or writing supplies, or garden tools, or shoes for the novices when the abbess wasn't looking. These backdoor trades were known, tolerated, occasionally chastised, but never quite stopped. Historians still argue whether this system was harmless barter or quiet rebellion. The records are vague. Most transactions weren't written down, but the results, tangible. Some convents grew wealthy, some angered local guilds. Some simply brewed what they needed and let the excess slip away with a knowing wink. You return to the convent by mid-afternoon. The kitchen smells like bread and stewed apples. Sister Hilda doesn't even ask what you got in return. She just takes the pouch and sniffs it. "Good enough," she says. You help her add the rosemary to a small test batch she's been tinkering with a mild ale intended for the infirmary. "Not every nun can handle the full strength," she mutters, "especially after matins." That's another truth you've learned there was beer for the table, beer for the feast, and beer for the sickbed. Healing ales weren't just folklore. Nuns understood the body. They grew herbs for digestion, sleep, and fever. And they often added those same herbs to beer, not just to flavor it, but to treat. There's a recipe tucked into the corner of an old convent ledger that lists barley, betony, lemon balm, a pinch of ground snail shell. You pray Hilda skips that last one. She lets you taste a spoonful of the newest infirmary batch. It's light, slightly minty, with a gentle sweetness. You can imagine sipping it in bed, half awake, while someone whispers psalms nearby. You spend the rest of the afternoon bottling. The convent's bottling system is primitive. Clay flasks, corks boiled to soften, wax for sealing. You sit with two novices, dipping bottle after bottle into a pot of beeswax, your fingers slowly growing stiff. The older novice, Ellen, tells you about a time a cork popped during evening prayers, and Sister Matilda insisted it was a sign from St. Bridget. "She made us drink it," Ellen said it would be ungrateful not to. You ask how it tasted. Like pepper and regret. Still, you like the idea that saints might enjoy beer. In fact, several saints are associated with brewing. St. Arnold of Soissons famously told his followers to drink beer instead of water during a plague. St. Bridget, of course, allegedly turned her bathwater into ale to serve visiting clergy. You're not sure if that last one is true. But it's a good story. And here, in this convent, stories matter almost as much as recipes. The abbess passes by while you're stacking the bottles in a straw-lined crate. She glances once, nods slightly, and continues on her way. That's high praise. By evening, your hands are speckled with wax, and your back aches, but the feast ale is safely stored. A few bottles are set aside for guests. One is tucked into a basket for a neighboring convent that sent over wool and lentils last month. And one bottle unlabeled, slightly larger, is left out on the abbess's writing desk. No note, just presence. Because sometimes sharing beer isn't a transaction, it's a message. A gesture of trust, of respect, of understanding. You sit outside the brewhouse as the sun sets, sipping the dregs of a sample bottle with Sister Hilda. It's not the strongest or the sweetest, but it's clean, honest, balanced. You know, she says, some people think nuns should be all prayer and silence. You nod. She smirks. Let them come here. We'll teach them how to pray with a mash paddle. You both raise your cups. To secrets, to trades, to flasks wrapped in cloaks and barrels rolled just far enough. To the quiet craft of women who brewed not for applause but for the ones who needed it most. The next morning, Sister Hilda doesn't assign you to the brewhouse. She tells you to follow Sister Beatrix instead. You've only met her once briefly, during a meal when she corrected someone's Latin mid-bite and didn't blink while doing it. She's the convent's bursar, but more than that, she's the one who handles what everyone calls the margins. Meaning the money, the trades, the outside world. You're confused at first. What does brewing have to do with bursar work? But as you follow her into a small, windowless room filled with scrolls, notes, and clay tokens, you start to understand. She sits, motions for you to do the same, and begins unrolling a sheet of parchment. It's a brewing ledger, and it goes back nearly 15 years. Each line is a brew batch, date, grain weight, herb content, fermentation time, yield, notes. It's more meticulous than any library you've ever seen. You run your fingers lightly over the ink, some of it faded, some fresh. You notice occasional smudges, odd notations, and at least 3 entries labeled only as. Beatrix sees you staring and taps one of them. That one exploded. Ah. She continues to explain how the convent tracks everything from how much grain is used per week, to how many mugs go to the infirmary, to how many barrels go missing mysteriously during feast days. Every variable weather, humidity, even the temperature of the cellar is accounted for. This isn't just brewing, it's data. It's also diplomacy. See here, she says, pointing to a line marked with a circled symbol. That was a special cask sent to the mayor's wife when she gave us roofing tiles. And this, she adds, flipping forward, was a batch we made with barley the merchants swore was fine. It wasn't. They haven't made that mistake again. You realize that beer, for this convent, isn't just spiritual nourishment or quiet craft. It's currency. In a world where nuns couldn't hold property in their own name, couldn't vote in guilds, couldn't preach in public, they brewed. And through that brewing, they found leverage. Historians still debate whether convents profited from beer. Some argue the money went entirely to maintaining the convent repairs, food, candles. Others say that in wealthier communities, abbesses directed brewing income toward education, hiring scribes, or commissioning artwork. There are even whispers never confirmed of convents secretly supporting poorer nunneries through gifts of ale, a quiet redistribution of resources brewed into barrels and rolled down roads with no questions asked. You ask Beatrix if this convent does anything like that. She doesn't answer. But she does hand you a sealed scroll and a small flask, packed in straw. You'll carry this to the priory on the other side of the ridge. Leave before midday. You know better than to ask what's in it. You take the bundle, pack a small lunch, and begin walking. It's a few miles through winding hills. The path is mostly dirt and roots, with scattered birdsong and the scent of wild thyme underfoot. You pass a wayside cross with an old rosary tied around its base. Someone has left a crust of bread beside it. Maybe for birds, maybe for God. When you arrive, the priory is even quieter than your convent. A single nun opens the gate, takes the scroll, takes the flask, and thanks you without asking your name. You catch a glimpse of their brewhouse, smaller, older. One of the vats is cracked and held together with iron bands. You understand. On the way back, the sun is already low in the sky. You walk slower. You think about the invisible network between convents, about how beer flows like lifeblood, not publicly, not loudly, but steadily, how it sustains more than just the body, how it connects. When you return, the brewhouse smells like fresh wort. You find Sister Hilda straining mash through cloth while 2 novices sing off-key. She doesn't ask where you've been, she just tosses you a ladle. Back to it. And you are... But something's changed. Brewing no longer feels like an isolated task. It feels strategic. That evening, over dinner, you hear the abbess speaking quietly with the bursar. Ascend 2 barrels to the priory, she says, discreetly, and a 3rd to the orphan house before winter. And later, while sealing casks, you notice a faint mark scratched beneath one barrel's label. It's not the usual symbol. It's a fish. Not for St. Zeno this time, for the priory. You seal it carefully. That night, as you sit in the cloister with a mug of small ale and the distant sound of evening psalms, you reflect on everything a barrel can carry. Grain and herbs, yes. But also support, strategy, solidarity. You've seen barrels serve as offerings, bribes, blessings, meals, apologies, and quiet acts of rebellion. And now, you've seen them serve as bridges. Between convents, between women, between needs too delicate for loud answers. You take a sip. It's not the strongest beer you've tasted, not the fanciest, but you think, perhaps, it's the most powerful. By now, the rhythm of the brewhouse has settled into your bones. You can stir a mash without thinking, identify the scent of over-toasted grain from across the room, and measure yeast by instinct rather than spoon. But today, Sister Hilda surprises you again. "You're traveling," she says. You blink again. This time it's not just a scroll in a flask. This time, you're going to help start a brew. Apparently, a smaller convent to the south, one that lost its brew nun to illness and has since been running on barley soup and borrowed ale, needs someone to help re-establish their operation. Temporarily, of course, just enough to get them fermenting again. You're not going alone. You'll travel with Sister Alex, a tough, square-jawed nun who carries a mending needle like it's a dagger and has been on more brewing assignments than anyone else in the convent. You leave at dawn with a small cart, 3 sacks of grain, a satchel of herbs, and 2 wooden spoons that have names, Judith II and Old Faithful. The road is long and dusty. You pass hills covered in mist, farmhouses leaning slightly from age, and a shrine tucked under an elm tree with fresh flowers at its base. Sister Alex walks in silence for hours, then suddenly turns and asks, "How's your boil timing?" You answer. She grunts. Apparently, it's acceptable. When you arrive, the convent is in worse shape than expected. Their brewhouse is small, half-roofed, and their last remaining fermenting vessel is cracked and patched with wax. The sisters greet you with tired smiles and a kind of quiet embarrassment. They've been trying, they say, boiling barley in the kitchen hearth, letting it cool in baking trays. The result tastes like watery porridge and smells like regret. You and Sister Alex get to work. There's no time for lectures. You scrub, soak, stir. You check their grain half-sprouted, but salvageable. Their herb stores are minimal, but you find enough dried marjoram and mugwort to make something drinkable. The first batch is small. You boil it slowly, watching the mixture with a careful eye. The sisters hover nearby, watching you like you're turning lead into gold. Which, in a way, you are. When the cooling tray is filled and the yeast added some brought from your home convent, the mother divided like a sacred relic, you cover the tray and sit back. And wait. One sister, clearly skeptical, asks if it'll actually ferment. Sister Alex just says God is good. And the next morning, when the first bubbles rise, the room breaks into soft applause. Not the clapping kind, just nods, smiles, a collective sigh. Because now they know they'll have beer again. You stay another day to teach what you know. You show them how to check the mash with straw, how to strain with linen, how to mark the barrels. They have no proper casks, so you improvise with clay jugs and seal them with wax and prayer. It's not perfect, but it's something. Historians rarely talk about this side of brewing, the way knowledge traveled from convent to convent, quietly, like yeast on the wind. There are scattered records, one abbess in Lombardy requesting a visit from a brew nun after a fire destroyed her cellar, a sister from Saxony sent to help restore brewing after a flood, even rumors of nunneries sending coded recipes to each other hidden in psalm scrolls. Sister Alex tells you she's helped restore 4 brewhouses in her time. One was so broken down, they had to start with stone soup and stale bread just to make the first batch of small beer. But they always got it going again. Because convents didn't just survive on silence and scripture, they survived on resilience. You leave the southern convent with a gift 2 small jars of dried herbs, grown by their infirmarian, who blushes when you say the mugwort smells fresher than yours ever does. Back on the road, you feel taller, not from pride, from participation. You didn't just learn the rhythm, you passed it on. And that's what keeps this whole system alive. Back at your home convent, Sister Hilda greets you with a nod and a steaming mug of something dark and spiced. "You missed Judith the Bold," she says. "She foamed up again." You sip. It's strong, deep, comforting. The abbess passes by and asks how the southern convent fared. You answer honestly, "They're brewing again." She smiles faintly and keeps walking. You realize now that every time a nun rolls a barrel, stirs a mash, or lights a kettle in a distant convent, she's not just brewing beer. She's preserving a lineage, a network, a lifeline. One batch at a time. You sleep well that night? The stars overhead feel a little brighter, and the wind through the trees sounds faintly like bubbling wort. The convent is quieter when you return. Not solemn, just settled. The feast day madness has passed. The steward's inspection is old news. The visiting bishop never did send a follow-up letter, which Sister Hilda insists is a sign of either deep respect or complete terror. You slip back into the rhythm easily, but something's shifted. The brewhouse feels smaller, not because it's changed, but because you've grown. You've brewed for feast days, bartered with herbalists, traded through markets, hauled casks across dusty roads, and revived a brewing line in a crumbling outpost. You are, by all reasonable standards, no longer an apprentice. But this morning, Sister Hilda gives you a look that says not so fast. "We're trying something new," she says, or rather, something old. She leads you to a dusty corner of the archive, a place that smells like beeswax and old candle smoke, and hands you a brittle scroll. You unroll it gently. It's a recipe. Sort of. More like a string of mysterious instructions in a blend of Latin, German, and someone's extremely opinionated margin notes. You recognize ingredients barley, fennel, something suspiciously close to mustard seed, but the process is creative. From a convent near Würzburg, Hilda says, long gone, burned down or bought out by a monastery, depends on who you ask. You ask if this recipe has been tested before. Once, she says, 30 years ago, it exploded. You get to work anyway. The ingredients are strange, unusual spices, a double boil, and something called moonwort, which may or may not be the same thing as mugwort depending on whether you ask a botanist or a poet. You substitute carefully, adjust based on smell, texture, and Hilda's occasional grunt of approval. By midday, the mash is steeping. It smelled peculiar. Like roasted grain. Yes, but also like mint, or hay, or burnt paper. You're not sure. As it boils, you keep a careful eye. Nothing explodes, yet. And you wonder what it must have been like for those long-gone nuns, trying something new, brewing a batch they'd never tasted before, trusting hands and instinct, and maybe just a little divine guidance. Because not every brew is safe. Some convents took risks, pushed boundaries, flavored ales with experimental herbs, altered fermentation times, added fruit, or flour, or bark. Some made ales so strong they bordered on elixirs. Others went the opposite way, fasting beers, thin as broth, but still holy in intent. Historians still argue whether these creative batches were acts of necessity or defiance. Some suggest poor convents used odd ingredients because they had no choice. Others believe nuns simply enjoyed the freedom. Brewing gave them the rare chance to improvise, to innovate. Either way, you're part of that tradition now. You sit near the bubbling pot, reading the margin notes on the recipe scroll. One says, "Too bitter, try boiling less." Another simply says, "Saved for St. Walburga's night." You don't know who wrote these notes. Their name is lost, but their hands moved like yours. Their days smelled like this. Their boots echoed the same stone paths. You're not just brewing beer. You're answering a letter written centuries ago. As the wort cools, you add yeast, Not the mother, this time. A different strain, older, more temperamental, stored in a wax-sealed jar that Sister Matilda guards like it's made of gold. "You're brave," she says, "or foolish." You smile. Aren't those the same thing in the brewhouse? She doesn't disagree. You mark the barrel with a new symbol, a crescent moon and a star. It doesn't mean anything yet, but it might. The batch will take a week to ferment, maybe longer. No one's sure how it'll taste. That evening, you help Hilda bottle last week's infirmary brew. She watches you work and, after a long silence, says, "You've earned your own ladle." She hands it to you. It's worn smooth. The handle is carved with 3 tiny notches. "Belonged to Sister Clement," she says. "She brewed during the famine, saved lives with barley soup and strong beer. She said it tasted like wet bread and hope." You run your thumb over the notches. There's no ceremony, no candlelight or chanting. Just a handoff. Quiet, heavy with meaning. You hang it beside your bunk that night. Later, as you walk the cloister, you hear the faint hiss of fermentation in the cellar below. That batch, the odd one, still working, still deciding what it wants to be. Like you. Like every nun who's ever stood over a bubbling kettle and wondered if she was making something holy or something awful or both. The next morning, you wake early, you peek into the cask. Bubbles, slow, steady, promising. And somehow, that's enough. The experimental brew is still bubbling quietly when you rise the next morning. You touch the side of the barrel. It's warm, but not hot. The yeast is active, doing its slow and invisible work. Sister Hilda calls it the patient miracle. You're starting to understand what she means. She gives you a few days off brewing. Let it rest, she says. And you, too. But of course, you don't. Because brewing might be your task, but now it's also your curiosity, your rhythm, your ritual. So you wander. You help in the herb garden, brushing dust from yarrow and clipping the last of the summer basil. You mend the straps of the grain sacks. You sweep the steps of the brewhouse, even though no one asked. And at night, you read. Sister Beatrix lets you borrow an old brewing manual part recipe book, part philosophical treatise, all penned by a nun whose name has long since flaked off the cover. The margins are filled with notes "Don't trust July barley" and "Keep singing while stirring," and, underlined twice, "No angel ever helped with the bottling." You laugh out loud at that one. There's a long tradition of nuns writing about beer. Quietly, of course, often in code, tucked into gardening journals, prayer books, herbal indexes. Brewing knowledge was passed along not just in action, but in ink hidden in plain sight among Latin scripture and recipe lists. Sometimes, those notes were all that survived a convent's destruction. Not the casks, not the buildings. Just a phrase, "Add wormwood for winter ales," or 3 boils. Then a blessing. Historians still argue whether these texts should be considered scientific or spiritual. Some say they're merely records of household chores. Others insist they represent a sophisticated understanding of chemistry, preservation, even microbiology before anyone had words for it. You lean toward both. Because what is brewing if not a science dressed in ritual? What is monastic life if not structure shaped by spirit? You find a passage describing beer for dying mouths, a special brew given to the gravely ill warm, thinned with honey, steeped in marjoram and thyme, not to heal, not really, just to soothe. Just to say you are still cared for? You close the book gently. That afternoon, Sister Agnes lets you help deliver a batch of that very brew to the infirmary. One of the elder nuns, frail and sunken-eyed, sips it slowly. Her fingers tremble, but she smiles afterward. A thin smile. Real. "Still better than the bishop's wine," she whispers. You help clean the mugs, refill the barrels, Stir the next batch. You check your experimental brew again. It's nearly ready. The scent has changed deeper now, less uncertain, somewhere between nutmeg and toasted grain. You tap off a tiny sample and let Sister Hilda taste it. She swishes, pauses, and gives a grunt. Unexpected, she says, but not unpleasant. High praise. You bottle it with care. Only 5 flasks, just enough to share. One goes to the abbess, who raises a brow but drinks without comment. One to Sister Beatrix, who records it in the ledger under the name Luna Ale. One you offer to Sister Matilda, who can't drink much but takes a polite sip and says, "Tastes like old secrets. I like it." One you leave in the cellar, marked with a star and a question mark. And the last? You keep that one. Not to drink, just to hold. To remind yourself that even strange batches deserve a place on the shelf. That evening, the novices gather for a quiet hymn under the linden tree. You sit among them, the bottle resting in your lap, still sealed. One novice asks you how to know if a brew will turn out well. You pause. Then say you don't. They all look disappointed. Then you add, but you listen, you stir, you wait. And if you're lucky, something good bubbles up. They nod. That's enough. You close your eyes and listen to the singing soft, off-key, warm, like steam rising from a morning kettle. And you realize this is why you stayed. Not for the recipes, not even for the beer, but for the stillness between the batches. The pause, the breath. The understanding that in this place, every small effort matters. Every ladle, every herb, every moment of care. Tomorrow, the barrels will need checking again. The grain will need milling. A guest may arrive. A feast may be planned, or canceled, or overflowed. But tonight, the stars blink softly above the cloister roof. The ale is resting, and so are you. The season is changing. You feel it first in the mornings, cooler, slower, a hint of wood smoke riding the mist. The convent's garden gives up the last of its basil and lavender. The cabbages huddle tighter. The hops, once green and full, are drying into little golden husks. And with the changing air comes a different kind of work. Preserving, preparing, brewing for winter. Sister Hilda calls it thick season. The ales get darker, stronger, less delicate, more deliberate. You help stir the mash with heavier grain, toasted darker, boiled longer. The herbs shift too from light mint and lemon balm to rosemary, sage, and cloves, flavors that warm, that hold. You're sealing more casks now. The fermenting room smells like a bread oven yeast and spice and sweet. Damp wood. It's comforting, like wrapping yourself in a blanket made of old recipes. You ask Sister Hilda if she has a favorite winter brew. She doesn't answer at first. Then says, "The one we brewed the year the roof caved in?" You blink. That's a good memory. She chuckles. "We had no chapel for 3 weeks. Froze through matins. Everyone caught something. But we brewed a batch with ginger and dried apples, strong enough to make the abbess bless it twice." That's how memory works here. Each winter batch tells a story, not of snow or feast, but of survival, of small victories, of brewing something good when everything else is falling apart. Historians still argue whether nuns brewed through the harshest winters or paused during extreme cold. Some say the risk of spoilage was too great. Others insist the cold helped preserve stronger brews, less risk of infection, slower fermentation, deeper flavor. Sister Hilda shrugs. We brewed when we could. We drank when we had to. You help bottle a batch flavored with dried plums, thyme, and a whisper of smoke. It's meant for the solstice, the longest night. You label it with a crescent moon and a flame. Later, You help stack the barrels into the deepest part of the cellar, the oldest part of the convent. The stones are damp, the air sharp and still. Sister Matilda tells you this cellar was once a tomb. Then adds, the dead don't mind company. You roll the barrel in silence. Back in the brewhouse, the fire crackles and snaps. The air glows gold. The younger novices are learning their first recipes now. You stand over one and correct her herb bundle. Too much marjoram, not enough restraint. She frowns. You smile. Sister Hilda watches from the doorway. You've come far, she says. You shrug, but you feel it. Not in your muscles, though they've changed too, but in your movements, your timing, your patience. You know now how long a wort should steep, when to strain, when to wait, when to risk something new. The abbess asks you to take over a batch from start to finish. You choose the grain, the herbs, the balance. You name it quietly, Saint Silence. It turns out well. They serve it a week later with rye bread and roasted onions, and Sister Matilda says it tastes like being heard. You bottle one flask and store it beside your Luna ale, on the shelf that now has a label with your name scratched into the wood. That evening, the abbess calls you to her study. She pours 2 small cups dark honeyed ale and hands you one. You'll leave soon, she says. Another convent wants help restarting their brewhouse. You nod. You expected this, but that doesn't mean you're ready. She adds, you don't have to go. You sip, think, then say, I think I do. She nods once, without drama. Then leave your ladle here, she says, and take another when you arrive. That's the way. You pass through the brewhouse one last time that night. Run your hand across the stone hearth, the smooth barrel tops, the little shelf with bottles that carry your stories. You hang your spoon on the wall beside the others. And breathe. Because that's what this has all been, in the end. Not just brewing, but breathing. Trusting that what ferments will settle, that what begins cloudy will clear, that what bubbles today might warm someone tomorrow. And as you walk beneath the stars, bag packed, cloak wrapped tight, you know, wherever you go next, whatever kettle you stir, whatever herbs you carry in your satchel, you will never brew alone. Not really. Not ever. And now, dear listener, the brewhouse grows quiet. The fire has dimmed. The barrels are sealed. The scent of toasted grain and rosemary lingers like the echo of a soft hymn. Even Sister Hilda, who never stops moving, has settled into a corner chair, mug in hand, eyes half closed. The convent breathes, slowly, deeply. Outside, the sky has shifted from indigo to ink. The wind whispers through the garden, tugging gently at the drying hops. The owl in the steeple stirs, blinks once, and watches the world without blinking again. Inside, the sisters sleep beneath thick wool blankets. The last of the feast day mugs have been rinsed and stacked. The brewhouse hums faintly, just the soft tick of cooling kettles, the slow drip of condensation, the sigh of wood resting. And the ale quiet in the casks ferments patiently. Not hurried, not loud, just doing what it was made to do. Like the women who stirred it, you, too, have done enough today. There's no need to rush, no need to finish anything. Let the questions of the day sink to the bottom, like grain husks in a vat. Let the warmth of the brewhouse follow you beneath the blanket. Let the soft bells of Compline echo faintly in your ears. Let the story settle. Like yeast at rest. Like steam rising from a kettle. Like peace. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply. You're safe. You're warm. And the beer will be better tomorrow.